A lantern swings in an abandoned mine shaft, casting shadows across chains bolted to stone, and the skeletal wrists still locked inside them. What happened in Coldwell camp wasn't just a tragedy. It was an erasure, deliberate and complete, that took a century to unearth. The wind off the San Juan Mountains carried a metallic tang on the morning of October 4th, 1910, when the first miner collapsed at the entrance to Shaft 7. His name was Thomas Garrett, a copper hauler who'd worked the Coldwell operation for 3 seasons without incident. Witnesses said he staggered, clutched his throat, and began coughing blood onto the frost-hardened dirt. By noon, 4 more men showed identical symptoms. By sunset, the camp physician, a contract doctor named Alistair Dunn, had quarantined the entire bunkhouse and sent a telegraph to the regional health authority in Durango. The reply never came. Coldwell wasn't a town in any formal sense. It was a corporate encampment owned by the Intermountain Ore Consortium, a Philadelphia-based extraction firm that operated dozens of remote sites across Colorado and Utah. The camp housed 218 souls, according to the last payroll ledger: miners, engineers, cooks, laundresses, and the foreman's family. No school, no church, no elected officials, just barracks, mess halls, and the yawning mouths of 11 mine shafts carved into the mountain's western face. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. If this story grips you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover in the coming sections will rewrite what you thought you knew about survival and human nature. Dr. Dunn's first report, preserved on brittle onion skin paper and discovered in a Denver archive in 2008, reads, October 6, 1910. Symptoms advance with alarming rapidity. Hemorrhagic fever, convulsions, necrosis of extremities, 17 dead. No response from Durango. Supplies dwindling. The camp sat 12 miles from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a single-track logging road that became impassable once snow fell. October in the San Juans meant early storms, and by the 8th, a blizzard buried the valley under 4 feet of powder. Coldwell was cut off. What Dr. Dunn didn't record, what no one outside the camp could have known, was the decision made on October 9th during an emergency assembly in the mess hall. Foreman Vincent Harrow, a veteran of the Philippine campaigns, stood on a table and announced the vote. Seal the camp. No one in, no one out. The motion passed unanimously. Those who showed symptoms would be isolated in Shaft 11, the deepest and coldest tunnel, where the temperature hovered just above freezing year-round. They called it quarantine. The sick called it burial. By mid-October, 32 people had been moved underground. Families were separated. Children were taken from mothers. The healthy, workers boarded up the main gate with timber hauled from the saw shed, nailing crossbeams until the entrance resembled a fortress more than a medical station. Sentries were posted, rations were halved, and then the dying stopped. For 3 days, no new cases appeared. Hope kindled. Dr. Dunn wrote that some believed the contagion had burned itself out. But on October 19th, a cook named Margaret Soames reported hearing screams from Shaft 11 during the night. Not the screams of the fevered, but something sharper, more deliberate. When a search party descended the next morning, they found the sick had been moved again, deeper, past the copper veins, into the unmapped reaches where the rock turned to shale and the air grew thin. They found something else, too. Shackles, dozens of them, freshly bolted into the tunnel walls. The search party leader, a shift supervisor named Carl Weatherby, returned to the surface and resigned his post immediately. He refused to speak of what he'd seen. 3 others did the same. Foreman Harrow ordered the shaft entrance sealed with iron grating and a padlock. No explanation was given to the remaining camp residents. But whispers spread. They're chaining them up. By late October, the food stores had dwindled to flour, dried beans, and salted pork, enough for perhaps 2 more weeks. The snowpack outside stood 6 feet deep. Hunting parties brought back nothing. The wildlife had migrated or gone to ground. The radio telegraph, installed just that spring, had gone silent after the 15th. Whether the equipment failed or Durango stopped listening, no one could say. On October 27th, a miner named Jacob Lorne broke into the foreman's quarters and stole a revolver. He was subdued, but not before he fired twice into the ceiling and screamed that Harrow was feeding them lies. What was he lying about? Dr. Dunn's journal ends on October 30th. The final entry is a single line. God forgive us for what we've chosen. The camp went dark after that. No more telegraphs. No more smoke from the chimneys visible to the logging crews 20 miles south. When the spring thaw came in April of 1911, a state marshal and a medical examiner rode into Coldwell expecting to find graves, survivors, maybe a few holdouts waiting for rescue. They found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no trace that 200 people had ever lived there. Just 11 open mine shafts and the wind howling through empty barracks. For 100 years, Coldwell remained a footnote in Colorado mining disasters. A camp lost to plague and winter, its inhabitants assumed dead or scattered. But in 2010, a university-led geological survey drilling core samples half a mile from the old site punctured a void that shouldn't have existed. When they lowered a camera into the cavity, the first image that came back was a human skull still locked in rusted iron, and behind it, descending into the dark, were dozens more. The drill bit punched through solid limestone and dropped 18 feet into empty space. A void geologists would later describe as architecturally impossible. This wasn't a natural formation, and what lay inside would force investigators to question every official record of Coldwell's disappearance. The Colorado School of Mines survey team had been mapping mineral deposits for a proposed water reclamation project when their equipment registered the anomaly on June 12, 2010. Lead geologist Dr. Sarah Veneman initially suspected a collapsed lava tube or karst cavity, common enough in the region. But the void's dimensions defied expectation. Roughly 200 feet long, 40 feet wide, positioned precisely beneath where Coldwell's Shaft 11 had been documented in Intermountain Ore Consortium blueprints from 1909. The blueprints showed Shaft 11 terminating at 380 feet. The cavity sat at 512. Someone had kept digging. Dr. Veneman's team lowered a fiber optic camera on 800 feet of cable. The first images transmitted to the surface monitor showed worked stone, chisel marks, support timbers, a ceiling reinforced with hand-hewn beams still bearing bark. Then the lens panned downward. Chains, iron rings, bones. The camera's timestamp read 11:07 a.m. when the first skeleton came into focus. It hung suspended from the wall by wrist manacles, the skull tilted forward, jaw agape. Cloth remnants clung to the ribcage. Wool, possibly a work shirt. Behind it, stretching into the tunnel's receding darkness, were more. Dozens more. Some chained upright. Others collapsed in heaps where the restraints had finally corroded through. Dr. Veneman shut down the drill site immediately and contacted the county medical examiner's office. Within 48 hours, the location was designated a forensic scene and cordoned off by state authorities. A specialized recovery team from the National Institute of Justice arrived on June 18th with ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists, and a mandate to document everything before extraction began. What they documented rewrote Coldwell's history. The cavity, officially termed Extension 11B in the final report, wasn't a mine shaft, it was a prison. The walls bore tool marks consistent with frantic, unskilled labor. Support beams had been installed haphazardly, some at dangerous angles that suggested desperation over engineering knowledge. Ventilation was non-existent beyond a single 4-inch borehole drilled at a steep upward angle, likely intended to prevent asphyxiation, but insufficient for more than a handful of occupants. They found 53 skeletons in the first sweep. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Miles Crenshaw, who led the bone analysis, noted identical patterns across the remains. Wrist trauma consistent with prolonged restraint, rib fractures indicating blunt force, and, most disturbingly, evidence of perimortem dismemberment on 11 bodies. The cuts were crude, made with mining tools rather than surgical instruments. These people were butchered, Dr. Crenshaw stated in his preliminary report. Not autopsied, not prepared for burial, butchered. They weren't just dying down there. The recovery team worked in shifts, cataloging each skeleton's position, photographing the scene from multiple angles, collecting fabric samples and any personal effects. They found belt buckles, boot nails, a child's wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse. One skeleton, a woman's based on pelvic structure, wore a tarnished wedding band engraved with initials MS and JS, 1907. Margaret Soames, the cook who'd reported hearing screams. Her remains were shackled 15 feet from the cavity entrance, positioned where she would have seen everyone brought in after her. But the artifacts that stopped the investigation cold were discovered on July 2, 2010, when a graduate assistant noticed a leather satchel wedged behind a collapsed support beam. Inside were 3 journals, their pages warped by moisture and time but still legible. The handwriting matched samples from Dr. Alistair Dunn's archived medical correspondence. He'd been down there, recording, until the end. The journals were immediately transferred to a climate-controlled facility at the University of Colorado Boulder for preservation and analysis. Historians and paleographers spent 6 weeks carefully separating pages, photographing each one under UV light to recover faded ink, and transcribing the contents. What they read was a chronicle of systematic execution disguised as quarantine. Dr. Dunn's entries began on October 9, 1910, the day the camp voted to seal itself, and continued until November 14th. The first entries describe the fever's progression, the symptoms, the deaths, clinical, detached. But by October 21st, the tone shifts. Octanta 21 Harrow has taken control of all medical decisions. The sick are no longer isolated. They are imprisoned. I objected. He said survival requires difficult calculus. Weatherby supports him. I am outnumbered. The difficult calculus became clear in subsequent entries. As food stores dwindled and winter tightened its grip, Foreman Harrow convened a second vote among the healthy workers. The question wasn't about rescue or rationing. It was about who lived and who didn't. The sick were consuming resources. They would die anyway. Why let them drag the healthy down with them? 37 men voted yes. 4 voted no. Dr. Dunn abstained. On October 23rd, the first executions began. But calling them executions implies quickness, maybe even mercy. What happened in Extension 11B was neither. The journals describe workers, men who'd shared meals and shifts with the condemned, dragging the fevered down into the deep shaft, chaining them to the walls, and leaving them with minimal water and no food. Some lasted days. Others, weakened by illness, died within hours. Dr. Dunn writes of visiting the cavity once, on October 26th, at Harrow's insistence. October 26 descended to witness the work. I will not describe what I saw. I cannot. Harrow insists this is triage. I know the word he seeks is murder. Yet Dr. Dunn stayed, recorded, bore witness. Why didn't he try to stop it? Why didn't anyone? The journals reveal that dissent was met with immediate reprisal. Jacob Lorne, the miner who'd stolen the revolver, was added to the sick list despite showing no symptoms. Margaret Soames, who'd reported the screams, was accused of hoarding food and dragged underground the same night. Foreman Harrow had appointed enforcers, men like Carl Weatherby, who carried pickaxe handles and ensured compliance. The camp had fractured into two populations, the executioners and the condemned, and the line between them grew thinner every day. Because by early November, the food was gone, and the fever wasn't what killed them anymore. November 4th, 1910. The last rations were distributed at dawn, 3 ounces of flour per person, boiled into a gray paste that tasted like wallpaper. By that evening, the camp's leadership had calculated how long 37 healthy workers could survive if they stopped feeding the sick entirely. The answer was 11 days. Dr. Dunn's journal from November 5th describes a meeting held in Foreman Harrow's quarters after midnight. Present were Harrow, Carl Weatherby, the camp's blacksmith Luther Gaines, and 2 shift supervisors named Pruitt and DeKalb. Dr. Dunn was summoned not as a participant, but as a witness, someone to validate what they were about to propose with medical language. He wrote, November 5, Harrow presented figures, 37 men above, 16 still alive below. If we cease all provisions to the chained, we extend our own survival to November 16. Gaines asked what happens on the 17th. Harrow had no answer. Weatherby suggested we stop thinking in days and start thinking in pounds. The room went silent after that, Dr. Dunn recorded. Not because the men didn't understand, because they did. Weatherby wasn't talking about rationing. He was talking about meat. The first snows of October had buried the camp under 8 feet of powder. The second storm, arriving November 2nd, added 6 more. Hunting was impossible. Even if game existed, visibility extended barely 20 yards in the whiteout conditions. The camp's 4 horses had been slaughtered on October 28th. Their meat divided and consumed within 72 hours. Leather belts, boot soles, and saddle straps had been boiled into gelatinous broths that provided almost no nutrition. Starvation wasn't coming. It had arrived. Foreman Harrow's solution was articulated in a single sentence, according to Dr. Dunn. The dead cannot protest their usefulness. But the sick in Extension 11B weren't dead yet. Not all of them. On November 7th, 3 workers, Gaines, Weatherby, and a miner named Otto Fisk, descended into the cavity with lanterns and tools. They returned 4 hours later carrying canvas-wrapped bundles. Dr. Dunn, watching from the barracks window, noted that the bundles were long and narrow, roughly the dimensions of a human leg. The camp cook, a replacement for Margaret Soames named Peter Strand, was ordered to prepare the contents without asking questions. He complied. That night, the 37 survivors ate stew. Dr. Dunn refused his portion. He wrote, November 7. They have crossed the line from murder to desecration. I am complicit by silence. Yet to speak now invites my own chain. I choose cowardice over martyrdom. God will judge accordingly. The pattern repeated. Every 3 to 4 days, the same men descended. The same bundles emerged. The camp's residents stopped asking what they were eating. Some, Dr. Dunn noted, seemed grateful. Others ate mechanically, staring at nothing, their humanity eroding with each spoonful. Survival requires forgetting. By mid-November, the psychological fractures deepened. A miner named Samuel Corr refused to eat and was found frozen in his bunk on the morning of November 10th, dead from exposure and starvation. Another worker, James Pitlochry, tried to flee the camp during a brief clearing and made it half a mile before the cold took him. His body was recovered and brought back. It wasn't buried. Dr. Dunn's entries from this period grow erratic, the handwriting shaky, entire words scratched out or rewritten. He describes sleeplessness, auditory hallucinations, screams from the shafts that no one else seemed to hear. He questions whether the fever had been contagious at all, or if the camp's isolation and panic had simply catalyzed mass hysteria that justified atrocity. On November 12th, he examined the remaining chained prisoners during a supply run to Extension 11B. Of the original 16 moved underground after October 23rd, only 4 were still alive. 3 were unconscious. 1, a teenage ore cart driver named Timothy Goss, was lucid enough to recognize the doctor. November 12, Timothy begged me to end it, offered his wrists, said he knew what they'd been doing to the others. He could hear the butchery. I had no morphine left, no chloroform. I told him I would speak to Harrow. Timothy laughed. It was the sound of a mind severed from hope. Dr. Dunn never spoke to Harrow. The next day, Timothy Goss was silent. But the most damning entry came on November 13th, when Dr. Dunn describes an argument between Foreman Harrow and Carl Weatherby in the mess hall. The dispute wasn't moral. It was mathematical. They were running out of bodies. The cavity held only 3 living prisoners by that point, and the camp's butchers had been efficient. Weatherby argued they needed to extend the harvest to include those who died naturally. Samuel Corr, James Pitlochry, anyone who succumbed to cold or hunger. Harrow refused, insisting that only the diseased stock could be used, as if a semantic distinction mattered. The argument escalated. Voices rose. And then Luther Gaines, the blacksmith, intervened with a question that silenced both men. What happens when we run out of them and start looking at each other? No one answered, because everyone in that room understood the trajectory. Cannibalism wasn't a desperate act anymore. It had become infrastructure. And infrastructure, once established, demands maintenance. Who would be next? The weakest? The oldest? The ones who'd voted no back in October? Dr. Dunn records that the meeting ended without resolution. The men dispersed. But that night, someone barricaded their door from the inside. By morning, 3 more had done the same. Trust, the final casualty, was gone. On November 14th, Dr. Dunn made his last entry. November 14. The camp is a crypt inhabited by ghosts who have not yet realized they are dead. Harrow speaks of spring, of rescue, of resuming operations when the thaw comes. He is insane. We are all insane. I will hide this record in the hope that someone, someday, will know what we became. Not victims, monsters. The journal ends there. No signature, no final reflection. Just the abrupt silence of a man who'd witnessed the collapse of every moral boundary and could no longer bear to document it. But Dr. Dunn's record wasn't complete, because investigators found something else in Extension 11B that the journals didn't mention, something that suggested the story didn't end on November 14th. There were more bodies in the cavity than the 16 originally imprisoned. 53 skeletons total, 37 unaccounted for, which meant the hunters became the hunted. The math didn't reconcile. 16 prisoners chained underground, 53 skeletons recovered, and a camp that supposedly housed 37 survivors after the initial quarantine. Forensic teams realized the cavity had become something far worse than an execution chamber. It had become the camp's graveyard for everyone. Dr. Elena Torrijas, the forensic pathologist assigned to the skeletal analysis in 2010, noticed the discrepancy during her third week examining remains. The bones told conflicting stories. Some showed evidence of prolonged starvation, cortical thinning, porous lesions consistent with scurvy and malnutrition. Others displayed acute trauma, skull fractures, cervical vertebrae snapped cleanly, rib cages caved inward from blunt force. Two populations, two modes of death. The chained prisoners had starved or succumbed to exposure, but the additional 37 had been killed violently, then dragged below and deposited in the furthest reaches of the cavity, where Dr. Dunn's journals never ventured. What happened after November 14th? The answer emerged from a secondary source discovered in August 2010, when a retired postal historian named Graham Lindquist contacted the Colorado State Archives with a letter he'd purchased at an estate sale in Montrose. The envelope, postmarked December 3, 1910, from Durango, had been addressed to a Philadelphia office, the headquarters of Intermountain Ore Consortium. Inside was a single-page report written in clipped, official prose. Regret to inform, Coldwell Camp lost. Quarantine failure. Marshal Tibbs dispatched November 28 reports, no survivors, structures intact but abandoned. Recommend site closure and asset liquidation. Further inquiry inadvisable given liability exposure. The signature belonged to a regional administrator named Howard Cleff, but the report contradicted Marshal Tibbs's own filed testimony, archived separately in the Durango County records, which stated he'd never reached Coldwell due to impassable roads and had returned after 3 days. Someone was lying, and the lies pointed to a cover-up that began before the last body went cold. Historians cross-referenced shipping manifests, telegraph logs, and corporate payroll records. What they found was a pattern of deliberate erasure. Intermountain Ore Consortium had filed for bankruptcy in April 1911, citing operational losses due to natural disaster. The company's assets, including all Coldwell property deeds, equipment inventories, and personnel files, were sold to a Philadelphia creditor who dissolved them immediately. No death certificates were issued. No families were notified. The camp simply vanished from corporate and governmental memory. But the timeline revealed something investigators hadn't anticipated. People left Coldwell alive. A general store ledger from the town of Silverton, 60 miles northwest, recorded a transaction on November 21, 1910. A man matching Foreman Vincent Harrow's description purchased ammunition, dried venison, and 2 wool blankets, paying in company scrip that would have been worthless anywhere except a mining camp. 3 days later, a woman resembling the camp laundress, Anna Greaves, appeared at a Catholic mission in Ouray, claiming to be a widow fleeing a failed homestead. She stayed one night and left before dawn. Others surfaced in scattered records, brief mentions, aliases, movements that suggested a desperate diaspora of survivors scattering into the territories before winter locked down completely. The recovery team estimated that between 8 and 12 individuals escaped Coldwell sometime in mid to late November, which meant the remaining 25 to 29 died in the camp or killed each other. Dr. Torrijas's bone analysis provided the grim confirmation. She identified defensive wounds on multiple skeletons, fractured only where victims had raised arms to block strikes, shattered metacarpals from hand-to-hand combat. One skull showed a depressed fracture consistent with a pickaxe blow delivered from above. Another had been struck so hard the mandible separated completely. These weren't executions. They were battles. The collapse likely began in the third week of November, when the last chained prisoner died and the harvest ended. With no external food source and no remaining victims to justify the moral partition between executioners and condemned, the camp's social order disintegrated. Dr. Dunn's November 13th warning, Gaines asking what happens when they turn on each other, had been prophetic. Investigators theorized the violence erupted over remaining supplies, accusations of hoarding, or simply paranoia. A single altercation could have ignited the powder keg. Once blood was spilled, retaliation became inevitable. Alliances fractured. The barracks became battlegrounds, and the bodies kept going into the cavity. The living fed on the dead until they became the dead. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks on bones from the later victims, the 37, that matched patterns seen on the earlier 16. Dismemberment, butchery. But these marks were cruder, more frantic, made by people who no longer cared about method or efficiency. One skeleton, identified through dental records as Luther Gaines, the blacksmith who'd questioned the endgame, showed signs of being partially consumed before death. His femurs bore knife scrapes on the anterior surface, but healing patterns indicated he'd survived the initial mutilation by weeks, possibly dying from infection or blood loss. They hadn't waited for him to die. Dr. Tarias suspended analysis for 3 days after that discovery. In her notes, she wrote, "We are documenting the boundary where humanity ends. I am not certain we are equipped to process what that means." But the investigation continued because one question remained unanswered. Who dragged the last bodies underground? If the camp descended into chaos, if everyone turned on everyone, who survived long enough to dispose of the final victims? The cavity's deepest section contained skeletons still clothed, still bearing personal effects, suggesting they'd been moved there deliberately, not left where they fell. The answer came from an unexpected source: the ventilation borehole. A graduate student mapping the cavity's airflow in September 2010 noticed the 4-inch shaft didn't terminate at the surface. It angled upward for 70 feet, then turned horizontal, running parallel to the mountain slope for another 100 before breaching open air. The exit point sat 300 yards from the main camp, hidden behind a rockfall that would have been invisible under snow. Someone had engineered an escape route. Ground-penetrating radar traced the tunnel and found a small chamber, roughly 6 feet in diameter, carved midway along the horizontal section. Inside were the remains of 2 individuals, seated back to back, their skulls resting against each other. One wore a leather apron, consistent with a blacksmith's garb. The other had a medical bag beside him, the contents fossilized but identifiable: forceps, a scalpel, glass vials. Luther Gaines and Dr. Alistair Dunn. They dug their way out, then stopped. Why? The chamber contained no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle. Both men had simply sat down in the dark and waited to die. Starvation, hypothermia, or perhaps something simpler: the realization that there was nowhere left to go. The exit opened onto a mountain face in November, with no shelter, no supplies, and no hope of reaching civilization before the cold claimed them. So they chose the darkness over the gamble. But their presence in the escape tunnel meant they'd witnessed everything: the final battles, the last murders, the camp's extinction, and they'd been the ones dragging bodies into Extension 11B until only corpses remained above. 2 men, cleaning up the aftermath of their own species. Did they think they were preserving something, maintaining order, or simply delaying the moment they'd have to confront what they'd enabled? The journals offered no answer. Dr. Dunn's final entry preceded his death by at least a week, maybe 2. but engraved on the tunnel wall beside his body, carved with a scalpel blade into soft shale, was a single word. Contagion, not the fever, not the disease, the idea, the vote. The first chain bolted into stone. That was the sickness that killed Coldwell. 2011. A locked storage facility in Boulder houses 3,000 cataloged artifacts from Coldwell, and the research team stops publishing findings after discovering what Foreman Harrow left behind. The objects tell stories the bones cannot, and some of those stories were deemed too dangerous for public record. The University of Colorado's Forensic Anthropology Lab maintains a climate-controlled vault where the Coldwell evidence resides in numbered boxes on steel shelving. Standard protocol for mass casualty investigations. But in March 2011, after 9 months of cataloging and analysis, the research director, Dr. Sarah Veneman, submitted a formal request to seal portions of the collection from academic access for a minimum of 25 years. The request cited ethical concerns regarding materials that could inspire imitative behavior. What did they find? Most of the artifacts were mundane: mining tools, cookware, personal effects like combs and pocket watches. Investigators documented each item with photographs and detailed descriptions, building a material record of daily life in the camp before the collapse. But buried among the routine discoveries were objects that revealed the psychological architecture of the atrocity. In a storage crate marked with Foreman Harrow's name, recovered from what had been his quarters, researchers found a ledger. Not a payroll book or supply inventory, those had been standard, but a handwritten log spanning October 9th through November 18th, 1910. The entries were terse, numerical, organized in columns: date, name, decision, location. The decision column contained only 2 notations: R or E, retained or executed. Beside each E marking was a number indicating which day the individual had been moved to extension 11B, and beside some entries, 11 total, were additional notations in a different ink: processed Novern 9, processed Novern 13, and so forth. Harrow had been keeping score. Dr. Miles Crenshaw, the forensic anthropologist, cross-referenced the ledger names with skeletal identifications. Every name marked E corresponded to remains found in the cavity. But the processed notations aligned with Dr. Dunn's journal entries about the butchery dates. Harrow hadn't just ordered executions. He'd tracked which bodies were consumed, when, and in what sequence. One entry stood out. November 17th, V. Harrow, R. Location, exit. Vincent Harrow had written his own name, marked himself as retained, and noted his destination. He'd escaped. Further evidence confirmed it. A second artifact found in Harrow's crate was a hand-drawn map on canvas, detailed and precise, showing the mountain terrain surrounding Coldwell with a route marked in charcoal leading northwest toward Silverton. Elevation changes were noted. Water sources circled, rest points indicated with X marks. This wasn't a desperate flight. It was planned. The timeline suggested Harrow abandoned camp sometime between November 18th and 21st, matching the Silverton General Store transaction. He'd likely used the chaos of the final battles as cover, slipping away while the remaining survivors tore each other apart. But Harrow wasn't the only one who planned an exit. Investigators discovered a second map, this one tucked inside Anna Greaves's trunk, showing a different route heading northeast through the passes toward Ouray. Her belongings also contained a small leather pouch filled with gold dust, approximately 8 ounces, enough to survive for months if spent carefully. She'd been skimming from the camp assay office. The implications troubled the research team. These weren't panicked refugees fleeing catastrophe. They were architects abandoning their own design, taking resources, leaving others to die. How many people watched the leadership walk away, and knew they'd been betrayed. The answer came from a letter found in the remains of the mess hall, tucked inside a rusted coffee tin. It was written on torn ledger paper, undated, unsigned, but the handwriting matched samples attributed to Carl Weatherby. To whoever finds this, we were told rescue was coming. Harrow said the company knew, said they'd send wagons when the roads cleared. We voted because we believed him. Now he's gone and we're eating each other in the dark. If you're reading this, know that we weren't monsters from the start. We were just people who believed the wrong man. The letter's tone, equal parts confession and accusation, suggested Weatherby wrote it in the final days, perhaps hours before his own death. His remains were identified among the cavity dead, his skull bearing the pickaxe trauma. But the document raised a question the investigation couldn't answer. Had Harrow lied about rescue, or had he believed it himself until he realized no one was coming? The research team pursued that thread. They examined telegraph records from Durango's regional health office, correspondence between Intermountain Ore Consortium and state authorities, even weather reports from the autumn of 1910. What emerged was a portrait of catastrophic indifference. The first telegraph from Coldwell, sent October 4th, had been received and logged. But the regional health officer, a political appointee named Bernard Kress, was attending a mining conference in Denver and wouldn't return for 2 weeks. His deputy, overwhelmed by a diphtheria outbreak in Durango itself, filed the Coldwell report under pending and never revisited it. By the time anyone with authority noticed, the October blizzards had sealed the region. The assumption, never confirmed, just assumed, was that the camp's residents had either succumbed to disease or evacuated on their own. No one checked. No one wrote out. No one confirmed. Intermountain Ore Consortium's internal memos, subpoenaed during the 2011 investigation, showed even more damning negligence. On October 16th, a company accountant in Philadelphia wrote to the regional supervisor suggesting Coldwell be listed as suspended operations pending spring assessment to avoid paying overdue supply contracts. The camp was written off 3 weeks into the crisis. Foreman Harrow would have known. Company telegrams were routed through his office. He'd have received the suspension notice, understood that no rescue was coming, and made his decision accordingly. He didn't lie to his men. He just didn't tell them the truth. Was that better or worse? The research team debated that question during a closed-door ethics review in April 2011. Some argued Harrow was a pragmatist, a survivor who recognized futility and acted. Others called him a coward who sacrificed his people to save himself. Dr. Veneman, chairing the review, posed a different question. If you were Foreman Harrow, and you knew 200 people couldn't survive the winter, but 10 could if they left immediately, would you tell the 200? Or would you take your 10 and go? No one answered. Because the real question wasn't what Harrow did. It was whether any of them, facing the same arithmetic, would have chosen differently. Survival doesn't ask for virtue. The ethics review concluded with the decision to seal not just Harrow's ledger, but all personal correspondence and maps showing escape routes. The justification, recorded in the meeting minutes, stated, "Public dissemination risks glorifying calculated abandonment in crisis scenarios and could undermine emergency response trust protocols." Translation: they didn't want people learning that leaders flee first. But one artifact escaped the seal. A small item, innocuous enough that it wasn't flagged during the initial ethics sweep, discovered in a child's wooden toy box recovered from one of the barracks. A carved wooden horse. The same one photographed beside a child's skeleton in the cavity. On the underside of the horse, scratched in tiny letters, was a name: Brooke Milton, age 7. Brooke Milton, daughter of the ore engineer who'd tried to evacuate early, mentioned briefly in the timeline, but never confirmed. The family had been caught trying to leave in late October. Foreman Harrow's ledger listed them: J. Milton, S. Milton, B. Milton, E. Oxtitu 24. They'd been executed for attempting escape, and their 7-year-old daughter had carved her name into her toy before she died, as if she knew no one would remember otherwise. That toy sits in Box 273, available for academic viewing by appointment. Some researchers refused to look at it. Between 12 and 15 people walked away from Coldwell alive, scattered across Colorado and beyond, and every single one of them took the secret to their grave. The investigation became an exercise in tracing ghosts, men and women who shed their identities like winter coats and vanished into America. The search for survivors began in earnest during summer 2011, when a genealogist named Patricia Holcomb volunteered to cross-reference Coldwell's recovered personnel records with census data, death certificates, and immigration logs. If escapees had survived, they would have left paper trails, marriages, property deeds, Social Security applications after 1936. She found 9 confirmed matches and 4 probables. Foreman Vincent Harrow surfaced first. After his Silverton supply purchase in November 1910, he appeared in the 1920 census in Sacramento, California, listed as Vincent Harris. Occupation: warehouse supervisor. He'd changed his surname by a single letter, close enough to remember, different enough to hide. He married in 1922, fathered 3 children, and died of heart failure in 1958 at age 73. His death certificate listed no military service, no previous employment, no birthplace, just Sacramento, as if he'd materialized there fully formed. His children, interviewed by researchers in 2012, knew nothing about Coldwell. Their father never mentioned Colorado, never spoke about mining. When shown photographs of the camp and asked if he'd ever referenced those years, his eldest daughter, then 86, said he'd told them only one thing about his past: "I survived something that required forgetting." Anna Greaves, the laundress who'd appeared at the Ouray mission, was harder to track. But property records in Boise, Idaho showed an Anna Garrett purchasing a boarding house in 1913, the same year Coldwell's case was quietly closed. She ran the establishment for 30 years, never married, and died in 1946. Her estate papers included a safe deposit box. Inside, 8 ounces of raw gold, never sold, never spent. Carl Weatherby's letter had been wrong. He wasn't among the escapees, but Luther Gaines might have been. A Lucas Gaines appeared in the 1930 census in Butte, Montana, working as a farrier, a blacksmith specializing in horseshoes. The age, birthplace, and physical description matched. He'd listed his previous residence as itinerant and provided no family contacts. He died in 1934 from cirrhosis, leaving no estate and no heirs. The Butte Historical Society had one photograph of him from a Labor Day parade in 1932. He stood at the back of a group shot, face turned slightly away from the camera, as if he'd been caught mid-escape from the frame. Researchers found others. A Peter Stratton in Spokane who matched camp cook Peter Strand. An Otto Fisher in Denver who aligned with miner Otto Fisk. Each had reinvented themselves in cities far enough from Colorado to avoid questions, but close enough to familiar terrain that they wouldn't stand out. None had children. Most died alone. All left minimal records. But the most disturbing case was a woman named Elise Core. Samuel Core, the miner who'd refused to eat and frozen to death in his bunk, had a wife, Elise, listed on Intermountain Ore Consortium's dependent registry. She'd been living in the camp with him, yet no female skeleton matching her age and description was found in Extension 11B or anywhere in the Coldwell site. Patricia Holcomb traced her through marriage and property records. Elise Core remarried in 1912 in Cheyenne, Wyoming, to a railroad clerk named David Moss. She listed herself as a widow, gave her previous residence as Ashley, Kansas, a town that didn't exist. She lived in Cheyenne for 61 years, raised 4 children, and died in 1973 at age 88. Her obituary mentioned she'd been an avid gardener and churchgoer. It said she'd lived a quiet life dedicated to family and faith. It didn't mention Coldwell, or that she'd abandoned her husband's body in the snow. Researchers reached out to her descendants in 2013. One grandson agreed to an interview. He remembered his grandmother as kind but distant, someone who smiled rarely and never discussed her youth. When he'd asked about her life before Cheyenne, she'd said only, "I came from a place that doesn't exist anymore." He'd assumed she meant a homestead lost to foreclosure. When investigators showed him the Coldwell records, the personnel list with Elise Core's name, the timeline, the journals, he sat silent for a long time. Then he asked, did she know what they were doing? In the mine? The researchers couldn't answer. Elise had left no letters, no diaries, no confessions, but she'd walked away while others died. That was answer enough. What would you have done? The question haunted the investigation. Because every survivor had faced the same choice: stay and die with the others, or leave and live with the knowledge of what you'd abandoned. Some, like Harrow, had orchestrated the atrocity and fled when it consumed itself. Others, like Elise Core, had simply recognized the end and chosen survival. But all of them kept silent for decades. Even when Intermountain Ore Consortium dissolved, even when the records were sealed, even when no legal consequences could touch them. Why? Dr. Sarah Veneman proposed a theory during a 2013 conference on mass atrocity psychology. She argued the survivors suffered from what researchers now call participatory guilt, the trauma of benefiting from others' suffering, even passively. Speaking would mean admitting they'd lived while friends, neighbors, co-workers died horribly. It would mean confronting the possibility that their survival wasn't luck or cleverness, but complicity. Silence was easier, but silence also meant the truth stayed buried. The families of the dead never learned what happened. The company never faced accountability. The history books recorded Coldwell as a footnote: mining camp lost to plague and winter, with no mention of chains, executions, or cannibalism. The erasure was so complete that by 1950, no one remembered Coldwell had existed, except the survivors, and they were dying off. The last confirmed Coldwell escapee, Peter Stratton, died in Spokane in 1977. His obituary listed no surviving family. His estate consisted of a rented apartment, second-hand furniture, and a locked trunk. The trunk's contents were donated to a Spokane thrift store, where a clerk opened it and found stacks of old newspapers, every article she could find about mining accidents, avalanches, industrial disasters. Hundreds of clippings, spanning decades, carefully cut and organized in chronological order. And at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single photograph. It showed 30 people standing in front of a wooden building, squinting into sunlight. Men in work clothes, women in aprons, a few children. Behind them, a painted sign: Coldwell Camp, Intermountain Ore Consortium. On the back, in faded pencil, the ones who stayed, October 1910. Peter Stratton had kept their faces, carried them for 67 years, never showed anyone, never spoke their names, just collected stories of other people's disasters, as if he were searching for something. Absolution, context, proof that what happened at Coldwell wasn't uniquely evil, but part of a larger pattern of human failure. The photograph is now archived at the Colorado Historical Society. Researchers have identified 16 individuals in the image using dental records and skeletal analysis. All 16 died in Extension 11B. The photograph raises a final, unanswerable question. Did Peter Stratton keep it as a memorial, or as a reminder of the people whose deaths had purchased his survival? Both, perhaps, because memory is the price survivors pay, and silence is how they afford to keep living. 2024. The Coldwell site is unmarked, accessible only by permit, and researchers who've studied the case report recurring nightmares about chains in the dark. The physical evidence has been cataloged, the bones analyzed, the journals transcribed. But the question that haunts investigators isn't what happened. It's whether it could happen again. The cavity itself was sealed in 2015 after the final excavation phase concluded. Engineers pumped concrete into Extension 11B until the entire void was filled, entombing whatever remained unrecovered. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed no additional chambers existed. The site was capped with steel plates bolted into bedrock, then buried under 3 feet of gravel and topsoil. No marker, no plaque. Nothing to indicate 200 people suffered and died there. The decision sparked controversy. Descendants of Coldwell workers, traced through genealogical research, argued for a memorial. Historians advocated for preservation as an archaeological site. But the Colorado State Historical Preservation Board voted 8-1 for erasure, citing the need to prevent dark tourism and inappropriate commemoration of atrocity. Translation: they didn't want people visiting. The dissenting vote came from Dr. Sarah Veneman. In her recorded objection, she stated, "We seal the site because confronting what happened there forces us to confront ourselves. But forgetting is how we permission the next Coldwell." Her prediction proved prescient. In 2016, a survivalist forum discussing emergency preparedness for pandemic scenarios began circulating excerpts from Foreman Harrow's ledger, leaked, presumably, by someone with archive access. The discussion devolved into debates about triage ethics and resource optimization during societal collapse. One commenter wrote, "Harrow made the hard choice. 37 lived longer because 16 died sooner. That's mathematics, not murder." The forum was shut down after 3 weeks, but the conversation migrated elsewhere. Reddit threads, preparedness blogs, even a podcast episode titled "The Coldwell Calculus" that framed the camp's decisions as a case study in crisis leadership. Dr. Miles Crenshaw, the forensic anthropologist, listened to that podcast and immediately resigned from all public-facing research. In his resignation letter to the university, he wrote, "We studied Coldwell to understand how ordinary people commit atrocity. Instead, we've provided a manual. I will not participate further." The podcast was removed within 48 hours, but not before it was downloaded 17,000 times. The consequences of studying horror. You teach people how to replicate it. But the deeper issue, the one that keeps researchers awake, isn't the information itself. It's the realization that Coldwell's conditions weren't unique. Isolation, scarcity, fear, a leadership willing to make calculations about who deserves to live. Those variables exist everywhere. Antarctic research stations have documented psychological deterioration during extended winter isolation. Shipwreck survivors have confessed to cannibalism decades after rescue. Siege populations throughout history have descended into similar moral collapse when food vanishes and hope dies. Coldwell wasn't an aberration, it was a formula. Dr. Elena Torrijas, the pathologist, published a paper in 2017 titled Environmental Determinism and the Erosion of Ethical Frameworks in Closed System Disasters. The abstract's conclusion: given sufficient deprivation and isolation, any population will reproduce Coldwell's trajectory. The only variable is timeline. The paper was peer-reviewed, accepted, then quietly retracted after a military ethics board raised concerns about operational security implications. No explanation was provided. Dr. Torrijas refused to comment. But copies circulate in academic circles, and the central thesis, that morality is a luxury dependent on abundance, has become a grim touchstone for disaster psychology research. We are all potential executioners. The Coldwell victims' remains were finally laid to rest in 2018 after 8 years of analysis and debate. A private cemetery outside Durango agreed to inter the 53 identified individuals in a collective grave. No individual markers, just a single granite stone engraved with Coldwell Camp, 1910. May they rest in peace. The ceremony was closed to the public. 14 people attended: archaeologists, forensic staff, a priest. No descendants came. Most couldn't be located. Others declined the invitation. One researcher who attended described the burial in an interview. We lowered boxes of bones into the ground and said words about peace and remembrance. But all I could think was, we learned their names, we studied their deaths, and we still don't know if we'd be any different. The site receives no visitors. The grave is maintained by cemetery staff who don't know the full story. To them, it's just another old tragedy. Mining disaster, plague, history. But for those who studied Coldwell, who read Dr. Dunn's journals, who examined the cut marks on children's bones, who traced the survivors' deliberate forgetting, the case doesn't close. It waits. Because the conditions that created Coldwell didn't vanish in 1910. They're dormant: climate disaster, pandemic, societal collapse, any crisis that severs populations from supply chains and replaces law with leadership's arithmetic. In 2020, during the early months of COVID-19, a bioethics committee in Italy faced ventilator shortages and debated triage protocols. Who receives care when resources can't serve everyone? The guidelines they drafted included age cutoffs, survivability assessments, and utilitarian calculations about maximizing lives saved. The framework was rational, necessary, defendable, and it looked disturbingly similar to Foreman Harrow's ledger. The difference was transparency. The Italian guidelines were published, debated, revised under public scrutiny. Harrow operated in isolation, making decisions without oversight, accountability, or consequence. But the underlying question remained identical. Who lives? Who dies? Who decides? Dr. Veneman, now retired, was asked in a 2022 interview whether studying Coldwell had changed her. She paused for nearly 30 seconds before answering. I used to believe education prevents atrocity. That understanding how ordinary people commit horror would make us vigilant, resistant, better. Coldwell taught me we're not better. We're just luckier. We haven't faced the conditions yet. And when we do, when it's your child starving or your neighbor's child, all the ethics courses and historical studies won't matter. You'll do the math. Everyone does. The interviewer asked if she regretted the investigation. Every day, she said, but not studying it would have been worse. The Coldwell case files remain sealed at the University of Colorado, accessible only through formal academic petition and ethics board approval. Requests are rare. Most researchers avoid the subject. Not because the findings are disputed, they're exhaustively documented, but because prolonged exposure to the material carries psychological cost. 3 graduate students who worked on the excavation required counseling. 1 left archaeology entirely. The site supervisor developed insomnia that persisted for years. Multiple team members reported intrusive thoughts, imagining themselves chained in darkness, hearing phantom screams, calculating how long they'd last before breaking. Trauma isn't just in the past. It infects those who examine it too closely. And yet, forgetting is more dangerous. In 2023, a small private memorial was erected near the sealed cavity site, not by officials or researchers, but by a hiking group who'd learned the story. They placed a cairn of stacked stones marked with a hand-painted sign. Remember what we're capable of. Remember what we must not become. The sign was removed by park rangers within a week, citing regulations against unauthorized structures. The stones remain, unmarked now, just another pile of rocks on a Colorado hillside where nothing grows quite right. Locals say the area feels wrong, too quiet. Animals avoid it. Hikers report unease, though they can't articulate why. Geologists confirm the sealed cavity shouldn't affect surface conditions, yet vegetation struggles and the soil tests unusually acidic. As if the earth itself remembers what it swallowed. Some stories don't end. They just wait underground, preserved in darkness, until the next generation drills too deep and punctures something better left sealed. Coldwell isn't closed. It's a blueprint buried in academic archives and government files, waiting for the conditions that resurrect it. And those conditions are always closer than we admit. They say if you stand near the old Coldwell site at dawn, when fog settles in the valley, you can still hear metal scraping against stone, the sound of chains being fastened tight. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.